So, welcome to our next Limits to Growth lecture, and with our next invited lecturer, this time Johannes, and a topic that is probably not that familiar to most technical people in the audience. Today it's going to be ethics and morals of sustainability, and without further ado, I'm just going to hand over to Johannes. Thank you very much for being here for the second time, and we are very curious.
Yes, Benjamin, thanks a lot for the invitation and the kind introduction. Good afternoon to all of you. I'm very happy that I can be here again because I always think it's very fascinating, especially when it comes to topics of sustainability and climate change, climate engineering, to have this kind of interdisciplinary exchange. And so I'm very happy that I can be there one more time, although I'm very sorry for not making it in person this year to Goslar. I hope you can all see, whether you are online or in the room, you can all see the slides, which should now be available. And I will start maybe with giving you a short outline of what I intend to do with you today. So we thought about it before starting, Benjamin and I, that we will roughly subdivide the whole afternoon that we have ahead of us into 3 sections. And in the first section, I would like to talk, first of all, a little bit about some basic issues regarding ethics so that you get an idea of some crucial concepts that we use within philosophical ethics to debate on crucial questions. And then in the first section, I will talk about environmental values and their impact on sustainability issues. And especially, I will present you something like a short introduction into the main positions we have within environmental ethics to discuss problems of sustainability. In the second case, we will focus a bit, or not in the second case, in the second part of the afternoon, we will focus on sustainability and justice, and there especially on the case of climate change. The climate crisis is maybe the most pressing field of morally relevant sustainability issues. And in the third and final part of the afternoon, we will talk about questions of what I've labeled morality of sustainable conduct. There we will especially talk about the questions whether we all as individual human beings have some climate change related, or broader spoken, some environmental issues related moral duties or moral obligations. So this is the rough outline for the afternoon. And in the following, I will first start more in a lecture-like style, but please feel free to interrupt me and to ask questions at any time if there remains something unclear. And in the end of each of these 3 sections, I prepared a couple of slides with some exercises, some questions, some room for discussions. But I think one thing that is very special about philosophy as well in teaching, that we always try to discuss really a lot of things and to get into exchange. So please feel free whenever you have a question to get into to raise your arms or to let me know, and then we can talk about it. One last thing, I don't know what's the problem with my computer here at the moment, but I cannot see at the same time the slides and the window with the web conference from Clausthal. So if I maybe miss something and don't see a raised hand, please just let me know, and then just interrupt me and make yourself audible for me, and then everything will work out fine. So we are starting with ethics. Ethics is the topic of today. And as I just mentioned before, I go deeper into sustainability ethics and moral issues regarding the environment. I would like to draw your attention to a couple of concepts that are extremely important and very basic in understanding the ethical business in philosophy. So in philosophy, we somehow start with a main differentiation between morality on the one side and ethics on the other side. Morality, to put it very broadly, can be considered a system of rules, of norms, of principle, guidelines, evaluations, common sense ideas that guide human behavior and human judgments. So morality, if you want to put it this way, is the kind of reality we have. So what do people think about rules, principles? What do people think about certain actions? Do they consider them to be appropriate? Do they criticize them? All these things, we all label this morality. By contrast, philosophical ethics, or more generally spoken, ethics, because there can be other forms of ethics as well, for example, religious ethics. Ethics is considered to be the theoretic analysis of morality. So the ethicist is looking at existing moralities, existing norms and principles, and asks questions like, are these norms justified? Is it a good idea to follow these norms? Should we criticize these norms that exist somewhere in society? Should we modify the existing systems of morality? So ethics is somehow, if you would like to put it this way, the science of morality, a theoretical enterprise that seeks to justify, criticize, and modify existing systems of morality. Ethics can be done in very different ways. I simply wanted to mention one point, one way to do ethics, as it is very important for understanding the whole theoretical debates, namely descriptive ethics. In the first step, you can always ask yourself the question, what kind of morality does exist, for example, in a specific society at a given point of time? This can be an analysis done by sociologists who ask themselves, I look at my society and I try to find out what kind of moral rules do there exist, how do people interact in all these things. Within historiography, this can be done as well. So an historian can look into, for example, the Victorian British era, or ancient Roman Empire times, and all these things, and can ask themselves, if I look at the sources, what kind of morality do I find there? So we call this descriptive ethics, and this means simple to have a look at a certain society or at specific groups of societies and to get an idea of what do they think about morality, how do they understand norms, principles, and so on. In a more precise way, descriptive ethics, as I just mentioned, it is not the kind of ethics we are doing in philosophy. In philosophy and in environmental ethics, in climate ethics, in all the things we will talk about this afternoon, we are doing two things, namely things that are called normative ethics on the one side and applied ethics on the other side. So normative ethics is somehow the very basic enterprise of philosophical ethics. The normative ethicist seeks to develop theoretical answers to basic moral questions like how should we act and what is good in the world. So they can ask these questions in a very broad sense. For example, they can try to classify certain kinds of action and say these actions are morally justified actions, morally appropriate actions. Think of something like telling the truth. And on the other side, these kind of actions are actions that are morally blameworthy, that are in general morally wrong. For example, acts of murder or acts of lying. These are classic examples from the debate. So normative ethics, in a way, is the basic philosophical enterprise. And within normative ethics, you can find a lot of, we often call them families of theories that try to develop some basic ideas of how morality should work and how we should understand morality. I've listed on this slide only the two maybe most important examples from modern times, namely on the one hand, Kantian ethics, named after the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, sometimes called deontology as well, and on the other side, consequentialist ethics, and the most important example here is utilitarianism. So just to give you a very brief idea how these two systems can be differentiated from each other, and then you have as well an idea of what normative ethics is doing. So maybe we start with consequentialist utilitarianism because it's somehow easier to grasp the main idea. The basic idea of consequentialist ethics is to say that in every situation you should do the action that produces the best outcome. And the best outcome is normally measured by terms of pleasure and pain. So if you have a couple of opportunities for action, and you have to choose between these different opportunities or options, you should pick the one option that produces the biggest amount or the greatest amount of pain, of pleasure, of course, not of pain, of pleasure, of course. This is the basic idea. Always seek the greatest pleasure for all the people that are involved. By contrast, the paradigm of Kantian ethics of deontology has another idea, and here the main idea is that we should act according to rules that could be followed and should be followed by everyone. So if you are in a certain situation, in a specific situation, according to deontology, you should ask yourself, if I act in this specific way, would it be agreeable? Would it be acceptable if all people on the world would act in the same way when they are faced with the same or similar situation? So to give you a very basic example, if you this is a classic example from the discussion, if you are somehow on the way to a very important assessment center interview, so you want to have a new job and there is an assessment center and you are very well dressed and you are going there to have this assessment center, and then you are passing by a little lake and there you see a child is drowning. You are the only person that is around, and then the question is, what are you doing? Well, first option, you're stopping and helping the child. And the other option would be, well, you are so well dressed, you really want to get this job, so you simply pass by. And of course, the deontological answer is, well, of course you have to stop and you have to rescue this lake. Even if this means you're going into the lake, you'll get wet, you won't make it to the job interview. So it's clear what you have to do. And what is the rationale beyond it? Well, think about all other people who might be in the same situations. What would you like them to do? And then, of course, the answer is, well, you would like them to help the person who is drowning there, because, and this somehow is the clue of the whole thing, because it might be the case that once you are in the situation of the person who is drowning, so you have a strong wish in this hypothetical situation that other people will be around and rescue you and help you. And therefore, you are morally obliged to help in this situation as well. So this is sometimes called universalization, and I think from the example it becomes clear what is meant by universal principles. So principles that should apply under all conditions in all situations. So this is not very important for what we are talking about in the following, but simply that you get an idea that different families or types of normative ethics have very different ideas of how we should answer the basic questions, what is right, what is good. Beyond or next to the field of normative ethics, we have the field of applied ethics. And applied ethics, as the title already says, is looking at situations of applying moral principles, of applying basic moral intuitions. So applied ethics seeks to identify action-guiding principles and values with regard to specific branches of human action. So the applied ethicist does not ask the question, how should we act and what is good? But, for example, ask the question, how should a physician act within certain types of situations? For example, when interacting with patients. Or what kind of environmental states, environmental situations are good and bad? Things like these. So applied ethics has a lot of different branches and is subdivided into these different fields. We have, just to mention maybe the biggest one and the most important kinds of applied ethics, we have medical ethics, we have environmental ethics, we have engineering ethics, we have business ethics, but there are a lot of other ethics as well. Just for example, in the last years, we really see within our discipline a boom of ethics of digitalization and artificial intelligence. So there are a lot of fields of application. And what we are doing in the following is applied ethics. But of course, applied ethics and normative ethics are interrelated. Many ideas used within applied ethics originally stem from discussions within normative ethics. Now, before getting to environmental ethics, only one more slide. I've already talked about the good and the right in a couple of examples and in the things I mentioned with regard to normative ethics, but I want one time before we starting environmental ethics to draw your attention to this basic distinction, because it is maybe the most basic distinction we have within philosophical ethics, namely the distinction between right or wrong on one side and good or bad on the other side. In some situations in our everyday languages, one might get the impression that you can somehow use these concepts interchangeable so that they have roughly the same meaning. But in most of philosophical ethics, we really try to separate them and say that they are applying to different situations or different types of states or different entities. So, normally we say within ethics that right or wrong are attributes of actions. Actions, human actions, are the kind of things that can be right or wrong. So when we talk about right or wrong, we talk about principles and norms that guide human behavior. Classic examples, I've mentioned a couple of them as well. You shall not lie, you shall not help, you shall help other people. These are, as you can see, principles and norms that are directly guided at human behavior. And based on such norms and principles, you can decide whether a certain action was right or wrong, blameworthy or praiseworthy. On the other hand, we have states of affairs in a very broad sense, and states of affairs are the things that can be good or bad. So if we are judging something morally as good, we make an evaluative judgment about a certain kind of state of affair, about the world and the things that are in it. Think of different examples. I have three on this slide. This knife is good. This game is funny. This landscape is beautiful. In all these three sentences, you can find judgments on states of affairs, and judgments that are, first of all, somehow claiming that one thing is good or bad. So probably if you say this game is funny, you mean that this game is good, and it is good in a specific way, namely in the way of being funny. Likewise, if you say this landscape is beautiful, you have basically a morally positive evaluation. The landscape is good, the landscape is fine, and then you qualify it more specifically in the way of it is beautiful. And if you look at the first example, this knife is good, then you see already that there really is a difference between right and wrong on the one side and good and bad on the other side. So it would sound a bit odd to say, if the knife is cutting well, that you say this knife is right. We don't talk like this. Obviously, we use the examples of right or wrong to apply for actions, but not to states of affairs. And one crucial question, if you have this distinction, is how should we understand the relation between the right and the good? Normative ethics is working on this topic ever since ancient times, and there are a lot of different examples or solutions to this problem. And as you will see, this basic question of normative ethics has a huge impact on environmental ethics as well. Because in environmental ethics, we are first of all dealing with states of affairs, environmental states of affairs that we can judge good or bad, that we can judge as good or bad. And if once we have done this judgment, we can ask ourselves the question, what does follow from such a judgment for human acting? So if I judge a certain environmental state of affairs to be good, does this in a way imply some kind of obligation? So because the state is good, it is right for me to maintain the state, to not intervene the state, or to foster its maintenance, and so on. So here you can see already in a first way that there are important connections between the right and the good. So, and now I want to look back to the other side to see whether there are, up to this point, any questions or comments, but I don't see them in the field, and so I'll simply move on a bit into the field of environmental ethics. So, when we start about talking about environmental issues and environmental ethics, one way to somehow begin our ethical reflection is to think about different ways of conceptualizing our environment. I have mentioned only three maybe very important concepts on this slide, but you can think about a lot of other possible conceptualizations as well. So how should we think about the world around us? Is this thing we sometimes called environment well described as nature? Should we use just the term environment, or should we use the term creation, or should we use something else? There are a lot of possibilities here, historically spoken, as well as with view to our present times. And all of these different terms somehow transport different connotations that might be very important when it comes to discussing ethical questions. So maybe the first way, and I guess that many of you find this intuitively plausible given the area of studies that you are into, is to say, well, we should first of all conceptualize the environment as nature. If we conceptualize the environment as nature, we conceptualize it as something that is analyzable and understandable, relying on scientific methods from biology and many other disciplines as well. So the obvious strength of this approach is to say, well, environment is nature, we have a lot of knowledge about it, and what might be even more important, we have reliable ways of producing knowledge. So we know how the sciences of nature works, we know how to somehow find reliable results and all these things. On the other hand, quite some people within environmental ethics are, I would not say skeptical when it comes to the notion of nature. Of course, they are not, but they think that what is the strength of the concept of nature? It is relying on scientific methods, it is deeply connected to scientific research, scientific disciplines, that this connection might at the same time be a certain problem when it comes to ethical points, namely because the nature that we are analyzing, relying on scientific methods, is a nature without any value claims in it. So if we analyze nature as nature, relying on scientific methods, we do not analyze an environment as beautiful, as good, as rewarding, or whatever you have, what kind of possible value judgments. We analyze it as it is, the states of affairs that are there. So in a way to say, the concept of nature does not really have any conceptual space for evaluations, for moral questions, for normal questions. And this is one main reason why quite a lot of people in the environmental ethics camp say we should better talk about environments, because if we use the word environment, we are already talking a bit about us as human beings, because environment, you have it within the word environ, in the French term environ, being around someone. In the German Umwelt, we have it as well. So environment is an idea of the world that surrounds us, the world to which we belong, upon which we depend. So if we use the term of environment, we are already talking about us and not only about the nature that is out there somewhere. We are talking about us and nature when we talk about environment. At the same time, this might once again be a reason to criticize or question the concept of environment, because some people claim if we talk about environment, we have a picture of us being in the center. So maybe if you are familiar with the German term Umwelt, in this term we have it quite strictly. So an Umwelt has a center, there is someone in the center, and then the world that is surrounding it as the Umwelt, as the environment. So some people who say we should be very skeptical about the human position as being in the center of environment, they might be even skeptical regarding the usage of the term of environment in general. Third of all, I have another concept here, namely the idea of creation. Creation, of course, is a religious idea. If you talk about the environment as creation, then you have always included the idea of a god or some supreme power who created the whole thing, who is somehow beyond it. So obviously, the word creation is tied to very specific religious traditions, worldview traditions. Nevertheless, some say, well, it might be useful within environmental ethics, although I'm not a particularly religious person, so one can say it might be useful to use the term of creation, because if you talk about creation, you are already transporting certain kind of value judgments, and you are already acknowledging that the thing we are talking about is something full of value, that is worthwhile to maintain, to observe, and so on. And so just to give you a concrete phrase what might lie beyond this idea, it's a very famous sentence of the Genesis, the first book of the Bible, and the first chapter there, where God is doing the creation, and then there is the phrase, God saw everything he had made, and behold it was very good. So these are the kind of values that people who use the term of creation have in mind, to say, well, to call something as creation is somehow to accept that there is something of value, something that was that can be watched as being valuable in itself, being full of value. So these are maybe nothing more than a couple of spotlights, but I hope that this somehow gives you an idea about the importance of reflecting on our concepts. How do we conceptualize the whole thing we are talking about? And whether we decide here on one or maybe more of these different terms already has an impact on the way we are morally thinking about the environment in general. Okay, so now we really somehow come to the center of what we are talking about. Given all this background information that I've provided you with so far, we can now somehow ask the key questions of environmental ethics, and there are maybe two key questions for environmental ethics that I've included in this slide, and that are deeply interconnected. Namely, the first question is to ask, how should we understand the leading value of environmental ethics, sustainability? And the second question, what kind of entities are we looking at when we are talking about sustainability? Which kind of entities possess value and are important when we are talking about sustainability? You probably know that sustainability as a word is used in very different contexts and with a lot of different meanings. So you could write, and of course there have been written entire books only on different definitions and plausible or implausible conceptual approaches to sustainability. On this slide, I simply provide you with the maybe most important definition of sustainability developed in the 1980s by a commission of the United Nations, headed by the previous Norwegian Prime Minister Brundtland. That's why the commission is known as Brundtland Commission. And the Brundtland Commission formulated, we should use the world's resources in ways that meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So this is a way to develop the idea of sustainability that somehow looks at us, the present generation, in comparison to future generations, and raises the question, how can we live in a way that we can meet all our needs? And then, of course, the next question is, what kind of needs are there? Which kind of needs are important? Up to which degree do they have to be satisfied so that we can say they are met? And all these things. So on the one hand, we have the present generations, and then on the other hand, we have future generations. So this is a way to formulate sustainability that is somehow looking primarily at diachronic relations between the present and the future. So if you want to start from this very basic idea of sustainability, the next question that you can ask is, what kind of entities do we have to respect in meeting our needs? So if you want to live sustainable, where should we pay attention to? What kind of entities possess value? What kind of entities should we include in our moral reflection? And there are very different answers to this basic question. And these different answers, in a way, represent central traditions of environmental ethical thought. So if you look at different answers to these questions, you get somehow a broad picture of different central approaches within environmental ethics. We have answers to this question that say it's only the humans that count. We have answers that say all sentient creatures, all or maybe even all animals count. Or we have even far-reaching answers to say all living species, and maybe as well something beyond individual examples or instantiations of the species count, namely, for example, entire ecosystems, landscapes, and all these things. So once again, this basic questions, which entities possess value, the different answer to these questions give you a broad overview about the different types of moral theory that exist within environmental ethics. And looking at these different types is what we will do now in the next slides. I've prepared somehow some basic informations to the questions that you find in the last point of this slide. And we will start with the answer that states human beings are the only beings that possess intrinsic value. So there is only one kind of entity, one type of species that we really have to pay attention to when we are talking about sustainability, namely human beings. And this kind of approach in environmental ethics, which traditionally, historically has a lot of defendants, but which still is an important position in contemporary discussion, this kind of position is called anthropocentrism. So again, we have the idea of environment. Human beings are in the middle of the environment. The whole thing is centered around the human beings, and therefore we can call the whole thing anthropocentrism. So here the basic idea when it comes to sustainability is to say that sustainable action and environmental protection are needed insofar as they foster human interest. So all kind of environmental protective measures are based in the last on human interests. Now, what is important to understand this position adequately is to say that the notion of interest here should be understood in a very broad way. So, in the first instance, we have economic interest. Nature is a provider of resources. And, for example, take the classic example of the forest. If you don't have a sustainable forest economy, where trees have a lot of time, decades in many cases, of course, to grow and to regrow again, then at a certain point, future generations won't be able to use a forest as well as an economic resource because there won't be any forest anymore. And so one can say here we have a case of economic sustainability, namely the idea, use your forest in a way that later generations, future generations will as well have a chance to use this forest. But what is important now to see is anthropocentrism takes human interest in a more broader sense. So it's not only these economic interests, you have a lot of other interests as well. 3 interests I have here on the slide, namely, first of all, safety interests. So sustainable actions, according from this perspective, means that we meet our needs in a way that future generations can meet their needs as well and are confronted with situations of heavy crisis where their basic needs might not be met anymore, only at costs that are high to bear. So, for example, along these lines, you can say an anthropocentrist approach says fighting climate change is a very good idea because otherwise we will increase the risk of natural disasters, especially for future generations, and these natural disasters might really might be a big threat to the possibility of future generations to meet their needs. So again, here we have an anthropocentrist argument that can take climate crisis as a problem very serious. Something similar you can say, for example, with health interests. So one important use of natural resources is its usage for producing drugs, for producing medicines of all kinds of sorts. If nature should continue to be a provider of these natural resources, important provider for human health, we have very strong anthropocentrist reasons for protecting the environment. If we have a broad anthropocentrism, you can even include such things like aesthetic interests into your picture. So you can say, well, many human beings enjoy the beauty of nature. Many human beings enjoy being outside in the environment, doing different kinds of sports activities or whatsoever, enjoying the landscape and so on. And future generations will be human beings as we are human beings. So if we have this high aesthetic interest in nature, in the environment, it is very plausible to assume that future generations will have similar interests. And if they should meet these interests, if they should be able to realize these interests, we are obliged as a part of sustainability to somehow care for the future and to make sure that important landscapes, important ecosystems remain intact, so that later generations can enjoy their beauty as well. So once again, you see, this is in the center an anthropocentrist argument. It only looks at human interests, nothing else, but it can still provide some grounds for a very far-reaching protection in this example, protection of landscapes, of national parks, of intact ecosystems. So this somehow is a brief introduction to the first big family of theories, namely the theory of anthropocentrism. And now we'll go a step further and look at pathocentrism. Pathocentrism from the Greek term pathos, which means suffering or feeling, experiencing in a broader sense. Here the basic idea is to say that all sentient creatures, whether they are human beings or non-human animals, that all these sentient creatures possess intrinsic value. So those type of entities that matter within the environment, that are morally taken into account, are all sentient creatures. And now I'll have a longer quote for you. And why did I put this quote into the slides? Jeremy Bentham is the first big author in the family of theories that we call utilitarianism. If you remember back to the beginning of this lecture, I had utilitarianism as an example of one family of theories in normative ethics. And there are three big important utilitarians in the history. And the first of them is Jeremy Bentham from the 18th and 19th century. And in his most important work, Jeremy Bentham has a very famous paragraph on animals. Many consider this paragraph to be, in a way, the very first statement of pathocentrism, to be the very first explicit account of animal ethics, of looking morally for animals, and therefore I think it's worthwhile to read the whole paragraph. And just to give you a bit historical background, Bentham wrote this under the impression of the French revolutionaries in the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century, and their decision to ban slavery, so to not allow any longer in their colonies practices of slavery. And looking at this, Bentham writes, "The French have already discovered that the blackness of skin is no reason why a human being should be abandoned without redress to the caprice of a tormentor. It may come one day to be recognized that the number of legs, the velocity of the skin, or the termination of the os sacrum are reasons equally insufficient for abandoning a sensitive being to the same fate. What else is it that should trace the insuperable line? Is it the faculty of reason, or perhaps the faculty for discourse? The question is not can they reason, nor can they walk, but can they suffer? Why should the law refuse its protection to any sensitive being? The time will come when humanity will extend its mantle over everything which breathes." And there are two things I believe that are very important here. The first of all, you can see Bentham is raising rhetorically the question, is it the faculty of reason or perhaps the faculty for discourse that might ground moral value? And here, of course, he is thinking about classical traditions, which always said, well, human beings are the only beings that have a reason, that are rational, that are able to rationally act. Therefore, human beings are the only beings that are really relevant when it comes to morality. They are the only beings that can act morally, and therefore they are the only beings that do morally count. And Bentham here explicitly neglects this kind of logic, this kind of discussion, and says, well, this is not the case. When we look at morality, there's only one feature that is really important, namely being able to experience pleasure or pain. And if a being is able to experience pleasure and pain, it has moral worth and it has a value in its own, and this value has to be reflected in ethics and has to be taken into account. So here you find a very precise formulation of the idea. When we should think about environmental ethics, we should be pathocentrist and look at all those creatures that are able to feel pleasure and pain. So if you have this basic idea, you have already, and I think this becomes very clear if you look at the basic idea, you have a lot of consequences for sustainability practices. So for example, if in the whole planning of the future of sustainability, in our whole political discussions about sustainability, according to pathocentrism, we really have to integrate the future of non-human animals for their own sake. And I think this is something that rarely happens politically. So if you think about in Germany or in other countries that you are familiar with, if you think about the way we are talking politically about the climate crisis, about the future, are you aware of any discussions where we are explicitly talking about the future of non-human animals, non-human sentient beings? And I think this will rarely be the case. At least I'm not familiar with very famous, influential political debates on this question. So there is really a difference if you are approaching sustainability issues from the lens of pathocentrism. As well, for example, you might get some tricky problems to deal with when it comes to climate protection in comparison with other important values of environmental work. So think, for example, of the classic case of wind engines that are extremely useful and helpful for climate protection, for reaching the net zero goal, but that at the same time, at certain places, of course not everywhere, but at certain places, might really collide with respectable interest in nature conservation, for example, respectable interest in protecting certain kind of endangered species. And if you are a pathocentrist, this really raises some tricky issues for you, because both sides of the coin, so to say, have something to do with something that is morally intrinsically valuable. So for the pathocentrist perspective, here are quite some issues at stake. So I have one more slide for you, and then we start somehow in discussions, because then I really talked long enough without having any discussions. But the last slide I have for you before this is a slide that's very quickly presents two further centrisms, two further options for environmental ethics, namely biocentrism and ecocentrism. The basic idea of biocentrism is to say all living organisms possess intrinsic value. So the question is not whether an organism or a being has sentience, is able to feel pleasure or pain, but the only relevant moral question is, are they living creatures? Are they living human beings? If they are living beings of what kind soever, they possess intrinsic value. If there are no living beings, they don't possess intrinsic value. Biocentrism can be formulated in two different ways. First of all, we can have hierarchical biocentrism. Hierarchical biocentrism says, well, all living organisms possess intrinsic value, but some living organisms possess more intrinsic value, higher intrinsic value, because, for example, they are more complex organisms and therefore able of doing or feeling other things. So here we are again back to the things we have discussed before. Some kind of plant is a living organism, and some mammal is as well a living organism. But the mammal, for example, is able to feel certain kinds of pleasure and pain that the plant cannot experience, or maybe even the mammal is able to develop a sense for the future, at least, for example, for certain primates, that's certainly true. And so one can claim, well, the plant and the primate can both possess intrinsic value, but the primate's intrinsic value is higher. But there does exist as well a form of non-hierarchical biocentrism, and this claims that in principle all living organisms possess the same intrinsic value. So whenever something is a living organism, it possesses intrinsic value, and there are no principal differentiations between different kinds of living organisms. We only often experience situations where we really have to make a choice, and only in these cases, out of necessity, we are somehow introducing some kind of hierarchy. So, for example, if we need a certain plant-based drug to save a human life, then we can say, well, in this case, it might be acceptable to end the life of the plant, whatever this means exactly, and to use the plant as material for producing the drug to save the human life. So there we have made a choice and somehow formulated a certain hierarchy, but this is nothing like a permanent and stable hierarchy. It is simply done out of necessity, that we are selecting certain priorities. The last few, and then somehow you have the broad picture: anthropocentrism, pathocentrism, biocentrism, and then the last view is ecocentrism. And ecocentrism claims that not only individual living organisms possess intrinsic values, but certain collectives, unities, or systems possess such intrinsic value as well. So, for example, ecosystems, landscapes, or species, as such, as collectives, as unities, as systems, possess some intrinsic value. And there are many questions, and we will have an example shortly. There are many questions where it really makes a difference, whether you are, for example, a biocentrism or an ecocentrism, whether you are more looking at the individual organism or at the system, at the unity, the species of organism, whatever you have there. So if you, once again, somehow in your mind put these four approaches next to each other, then you see something like a growing amount of beings that possess intrinsic value. In anthropocentrism, we have only the human beings. In pathocentrism, we have all sentient creatures. In biocentrism, we have all living organisms. And in ecocentrisms, we have not only the individual organisms, but the unities, the collectives, for example, the ecosystems or the species as well. So, and now I have an example for you that I would like to discuss with you. But before doing this, I really would like to make a stop here and to ask you whether you have any questions at the moment, whether there are some things you would like to talk about that were too first that you did not understand. Please.
I would briefly interject, and we would cut the recording for now so that we do not discourage anyone from asking questions because they might be afraid ending up on YouTube forever. So give me 1 second and then we'll go, of course, for any type of questions.